Good afternoon. My name is Claire Finkelstein, and I am the Faculty Director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law and a professor at Penn Carey Law. I'm delighted to welcome you this afternoon to our pop-up panel on the situation in Iran and Operation Epic Fury, which initiated by the U.S. and Israel on the morning of February 28th, in the night between Friday and Saturday, or early Saturday morning in the Middle East. Late yesterday, the administration filed a war powers notification with Congress, and the president has released several videos on Truth Social explaining the operations and the goal of Operation Epic Fury. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, has given a press conference explaining the purposes of the operation. There have been Republican members of Congress who have served as surrogates on Sunday morning talk shows explaining the purposes of the operation, but the American public may still not be entirely clear. One of the purposes of today's webinar is to talk about the goals of the operation, some of the military contours of the operation, and to raise several legal questions connected with the operation. Namely, what is the authorization of the U.S. president in engaging in war and the commitment of U.S. troops to hostilities? And then from a more international standpoint, what is the international justification for engaging in war? We'll also talk about Iran's response, the impact of its engagement in hostilities against countries that were not involved in the original operation on Saturday morning, and the global impact of this overall military engagement. We have three extraordinary panelists to engage in this conversation today. First, General Joseph Votel is a retired four-star general in the U.S. Army, who was commander of U.S. Central Command from March 2016 to March 2019. Before that, he served as commander of U.S. Special Operations Command. General Votel oversaw the U.S. war on terrorism in the Middle East, particularly the Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve's fight against the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant terror organization, which rose to prominence in 2014. The fight against the group saw CENTCOM become more involved in the Syrian civil war and Iraqi civil war. After nearly 40 years of military service, General Votel officially retired in 2019, 5 days after the decisive Battle of Baghouz, which saw the territorial collapse of the Islamic State in Syria. General Votel attended the United States Military Academy at West Point and was commissioned in 1980 as an infantry officer. General Votel is a member of the Searle Executive Board, I'm proud to say. Next, we have Professor Jeffrey Korn, who is the George R. Killam Chair of Criminal Law and Director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at the Texas Tech University School of Law. Previously, Professor Korn was the Gary A. Cooper Distinguished Professor of National Security at the South Texas College of Law at Houston. Professor Korn served in the U.S. Army for 21 years as an officer and a final year as a civilian legal advisor, retiring in the rank of lieutenant colonel. His Army career included service as the Army's senior law of war expert advisor, tactical intelligence officer in Panama, supervisory defense counsel for the Western United States, Chief of International Law for U.S. Army Europe, Professor of International and National Security Law at the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General School, and Chief Prosecutor for the 104th Airborne Division. Finally, Ben Walhouse is a partner of one of Israel's biggest law firms, Herzog, Fox, and Neiman. Before joining Herzog, Ben Walhouse spent over a decade as the legal advisor in the Israel Defense Forces International Law Department. He has worked on international negotiations on behalf of the IDF and Israel, and worked on international legal proceedings involving Israel, including at the International Criminal Court and at the International Court of Justice. Mr. Wallhouse was called up to reserves during Israel's last major operation against Iran in June of 2025. Today he joins us as a civilian from Israel. Ben? Now,
Thank
Ben,
you very much, Claire.
great, he's there. We're going to start with Ben because at any moment Ben may have to duck into a shelter. Apparently, these alerts are coming every few hours. So I'm going to just ask you, Ben, can you tell us what the situation on the ground right now in Israel is like? Tell us a little bit about what the civilian casualties have been in Israel to the best of your knowledge, and what the experience is like of living with these constant alerts.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me, and it's an honor to be here with such esteemed panelists. And first, let me send my condolences to you and your listeners on the death of the American military personnel who have died during this operation. I pray that the fact that they died in service of their country is of some comfort to you and to their family members. And as you mentioned, Claire, I think I should apologize in advance in case I need to leave this panel. Since the operation started on Saturday, every few hours we've had siren alerts. We get them directly to our phone, a blaring noise, and it gives us a bit of an headway before the rockets or the armed drones reach Israel. And we're all in close proximity to bomb shelters because the entire country has come under attack from Iran since the operation started. Now, thankfully, we have incredible achievements of our militaries, the US and Israeli militaries, in both preventing and intercepting these attacks. But unfortunately, some have penetrated our aerial defenses and evaded our intelligence forces. There's been two mass casualty incidents since the operation started, one in Tel Aviv and one in the city of Beit Shemesh, both attacks purposefully directed by Iran at civilian centers. About 19 people killed overall and tens of people injured. There have been other attacks on civilian population centers in Israel, including near the Old City in Jerusalem and on other civilian sites. So multiple times throughout the day, we have these sirens. We all have to run to the bomb shelter and remain in there until we're given the clear to leave. And our country is essentially shut down. Our airports are closed. The schools and workplaces are closed. Tens of thousands have been called up for military service. Yesterday, Hezbollah in Lebanon decided to join in the fight, and since yesterday has been firing rockets and armed drones into Israel, mostly into northern Israel, but they also have the capability of reaching further and essentially covering all of Israel as well. And I think this just goes to show how acute the threat is from Iran and how intolerable that threat would have been if they'd been allowed to continue to build up their ballistic missile capabilities and certainly their nuclear program. A threat that would be intolerable not only to Israel, but also to the region, as we've seen the fact that, as you mentioned, Iran has been attacking other countries around the region. We can only imagine what those attacks would be able to achieve had they been allowed to continue to develop these capabilities.
Ben, is the Israeli population largely supportive of this offensive, or are they resentful, fearful, etc.?
Right. Well, as anyone who's familiar with Israeli society would know, we have quite a vocal and vociferous society. And whenever there's sort of disagreement, people take to the streets and make their voices known. I think in this case, I can't speak on behalf of everyone, but there certainly is a widespread support for this operation. And I think that comes in recognition of the serious threat that Iran faces. I mean, we have even the leader of Israel's biggest opposition party has been on the airwaves in international media constantly throughout the operation, defending Israel's choice to start this operation and to act in concert with the US military, just because we know how serious this threat is. I mean, this is not a new threat. The Iranian regime has been stating clearly for decades that its aim is to destroy the state of Israel and after that, the United States of America. And they've acted on that threat as well. They've developed over the decades what they call the Ring of Fire, their axes with Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza and the Houthis in Yemen and other proxies in Iraq and Syria and so on. And certainly since the 7 attacks and the ensuing war, we've seen that they want to act on that threat of destroying Israel. So I think the Israeli public on the whole is very cognizant of this threat and sees the need in order to get rid of it.
Thank you for that. General Votel, how do you understand U.S. and Israeli objectives? But first, let's speak to U.S. objectives in this operation, since we've heard slightly different messages from the president and from the Secretary of State in this regard. What is your understanding of U.S. objectives?
Yeah, thank you, Claire. It's good to be with you and with our fellow panelists here. I mean, I think I'm paying most attention to what the Secretary of Defense and what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs talked about yesterday, which was principally focused on military objectives of going after the military capabilities of Iran. Certainly, the concern about the nuclear weapons program, and so there's been a focus on making sure that they cannot get to a nuclear weapon. Second of all, has been on their ability to use ballistic missiles and drones to strike back, and so there's been a heavy focus on that. And of course, there's been an extraordinary focus on the command and control apparatus of the country, starting with the removal not just of the supreme leader, but of the top echelon, and maybe a little bit below that of the leadership, which is which we've all seen. I think what the U.S. and Israel are trying to do with this really comes down to see three things. It's paralyze the command and control capabilities of the Iranians, destroy their means of retaliation. We've certainly seen that now in the last couple of days, going after ballistic missiles, going after their navy, and removing those capabilities from conducting any type of activities in the Straits of Hormuz, and then finally beginning to degrade and the ability of the remnants of the regime leadership to control the population. So in the last day or so, we've seen extraordinary targeting of the internal security apparatus, that is the headquarters, the other means that are used to control the population. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing. I expect that's what we'll continue to see in the days going forward. I think it's critical from a military standpoint that we address the retaliatory capability of the remnants of the regime right now.
So if I can just follow that up a little bit to understand better, the president sounded as though the objective was regime change. The Secretary of State sounded as though the objective was more self-defense oriented and oriented towards Iran's nuclear capabilities. In your understanding, and you did say you were orienting more towards the Secretary of State's remarks, are the actions that you describe necessary to secure the U.S. with regard to a self-defense posture based on the nuclear threat that Iran posed?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, just one slight adjustment there. My remarks are really focused on what the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Hegseth, and the chairman said yesterday, which I think was an attempt to dial it in on the military objectives. I mean, very clearly the president talked about regime change and the reason for us interacting in this is still a little bit unclear in my mind. I mean, I think I am viewing this as a preventive employment of military force right now. I know there's been some suggestion that it's preemptive, that there was something imminent. I've not seen that. I'm just another person looking at this, but to me it looks like a preventive activity. In terms of kind of the nuclear capabilities here, I think what we've seen in the last 24 hours has been a focus back onto the nuclear capabilities. For example, yesterday, I think, or the second, we actually struck the Natanz site again. That's the first time we went after it in this campaign. In terms of their abilities, we really don't where they were. We don't really have a complete assessment, a complete public assessment of what damage was done last June. But just a review of it. There was extensive damage to a number of the sites. Of course, we couldn't get underground. Much of the fuel enrichment, of the topside fuel enrichment, was addressed. There we couldn't get underneath to see what happened to some of the deep enrichment. Most of the capabilities that develop centrifuges, certainly the heavy water plant at Iraq was destroyed and rendered inoperable during June. So my assessment was, I mean, what we kind of heard was there was obliteration of the capability. There was severe damage of it, and the estimates that I've seen have postulated that that damage, to repair that damage, went from anywhere from a few months to up to 2 years. So it's very difficult to make an accurate assessment on where they were. Clearly, in this instance, our national leadership and leadership of Israel considered this to be serious.
Right, good.
Yeah, and I think, Claire, from an Israeli perspective, I think what General Vertel is saying tracks that Israeli officials have made it pretty clear that they're not out to seek regime change for the sake of regime change. Our UN ambassador at the Security Council, for example, made it pretty explicit that our aims are towards their military capabilities, particularly their ballistic and nuclear program capabilities. But this is the same regime that continues to seek those capabilities, no matter how hard we try and hit them, and no matter how hard the US has made diplomatic efforts to try and come to an agreement to stop that. And if you take, for example, Israel's and the US's operations last year in June 2025, where both countries assessed that those operations were successful in seriously degrading those capabilities. But since then, both our intelligence communities have assessed that the Iranians have tried to rebuild those capabilities, and not only rebuild them, but put them so far deep underground that they're out of reach. So at some point, when you come to the realization that this regime, no matter how hard you hit them and no matter how hard you engage in diplomatic efforts with them, perhaps the only way to negate that threat is to actually knock that regime down. So it's not for the purpose of knocking them out so someone can replace them in the ring, but just to negate the threat by getting rid of them entirely.
Now, let me just point out here, we're not just talking about rebuilding from June. There was also an argument that some of that material was smuggled out and exported, put in other safe places, even possibly outside the country. So it seems unlikely that they could have rebuilt so substantially between June and now as to pose an imminent threat if we had significantly decimated their nuclear capabilities. Let me go on to you, Jeffrey, and to talk a little bit about the legal side of this and the president's authorization for this and the relationship between the president and Congress on this matter, because we're going to be hearing quite a lot about this in the next few days. There were two bills that have been currently proposed, one in the House and one in the Senate. Both bills are bipartisan. Whatever opposition there was to the June more limited military operation has become much more significant in the face of this all-out military assault. Talk to us about whether or not the president has the constitutional right to engage in this military action.
First off, thank you for having me, and I echo Ben's very thoughtful comments about the families and loved ones of the American service members who've been lost, and send sympathy to them and families in Israel. And unfortunately, uninvolved victims in Iran who are suffering the consequence of this regime. You asked the question, does the president have the constitutional authority to do this? I think the better way to frame the question is there a plausible claim by the president that he has the authority? As many of the listeners will know, the question of the division of constitutional war powers between the president and Congress has been a vexing issue since the inception of the Republic, when the founders' original draft of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 14 gave Congress the power to make war, and it was changed to the power to declare war. And there's always been a tension between the executive and the legislature over where that authority lies. I think you're correct. This operation is radically different than previous operations where Presidents Obama, Clinton, Trump in the first administration, and currently, and President Trump have sidestepped the issue of whether or not they are implicating congressional war powers with this theory of low-level, limited risk combat operations, which I personally have never thought was a particularly credible argument, but it's a theory that has been embraced by the executive branch through multiple administrations and has never really been checked by Congress. They can't make that claim in this operation. The scale, the intensity, the duration, there's no way to argue that this is not implicating congressional war powers. So I believe there is a constitutional requirement for congressional cooperation or involvement in the decision to wage this conflict or this round of hostilities. The million dollar question is, what does Congress have to do to satisfy that requirement? And there are really two camps that are emerging. There's what I would call maybe the formalist camp that says the president must obtain express statutory authorization in order to wage this war. Otherwise, he lacks constitutional authority. But there's another view, and the view that's been reflected in previous challenges to presidential war power through the Vietnam conflict, in the first Gulf War, in the air war against Serbia. And that is that the Constitution demands evidence of interbranch cooperation in support of the war. But how the two political branches choose to cooperate is their prerogative. And if Congress chooses to manifest its support in less than express terms, then the president would be justified and quite logically rely on that as satisfying the requirements of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 14. Congress has not acted one way or the other. I'll just read a sentence from Dellums v. Bush when a group of members of Congress and a senator challenged President H.W. Bush's plan of going to war in Iraq. And they asked a federal judge to issue an injunction because they said without a declaration of war or a statutory authorization, there is no authority. This is what Judge Green wrote. No one knows the position of the legislative branch on the issue of war and peace with Iraq. Certainly, no one, including this court, is able to ascertain the congressional position on that issue on the basis of this lawsuit brought by 53 members of the House and 1 member of the Senate. It would be premature and presumptuous of the court to render a decision on the issue of whether a declaration of war is required at this time or in the near future, when Congress itself has provided no indication whether it deems such a declaration either necessary or imprudent. Now, the wild card in all of this is the War Powers Resolution.
Right.
Because in 1973, Congress enacted a law that sought to clarify this situation. They didn't want future Congresses to do anything short of express authorization and then be able to say, well, we were supporting it anyway. So they created a statutory equation. Either the president gets express statutory authorization or the lack of congressional action must be treated as congressional opposition.
And hang on one second, Jeffrey. Let me just interrupt you to make sure everybody understands. If there isn't express authorization, right, because Congress has not declared war and there isn't a statute such as there was in the 2001 AUMF, then the relevant phrase is there has to be a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. So the question is, has that clause been satisfied? Can you
No, I don't think so. I don't think that the intent of the War Powers Resolution, which was to recognize that the president has inherent authority to defend the nation if there's an emergency created by an attack. George Bush didn't need to go to Congress on 9/11 to scramble fighter jets over Washington, D.C. and New York because we were under attack.
Right.
And the resolution recognizes that. In any other situation, the resolution creates a binary equation. Either you get permission or you don't have authority. And one of the great myths of the War Powers Resolution is it gave the president 60 days to go to war. It did not. The resolution says specifically nothing in this statute can be interpreted as authorizing the president to go to war. That 60-day clock was a fail-safe where Congress recognized maybe the president thinks it's a national emergency, so he goes to war, but we don't agree. And if we don't endorse it within 60 days, that means we oppose it.
So what you're saying, so I just want to make sure everyone's following you. If after 9/11, the president had not sought congressional authorization, then he would have been justified in going ahead and entering the U.S. into hostilities for 60 days, extendable for another 30 days. But at that point, his authorization expires.
According to the statute.
According to the statute,
But
right.
that provision of the War Powers Resolution has been controversial since the day President Nixon vetoed the statute. Because what presidents have argued is it's illogical. If I have constitutional authority to go to war on day 1 and I have it on day 59, how does it disappear on day 61 when you don't do anything? And ironically, and so to summarize, I think that if the War Powers Resolution were binding and enforceable, the president would need to go to Congress and get an authorization. And if he didn't get it within 60 days, then the statute says you must terminate the operation. I just don't think presidents have considered that provision constitutional. I don't think Congress has enforced it over the decades. They have refused to let a Congress in 1973 dictate how they manifest their support for the president. And it's judicially unenforceable, largely because of the doctrine of legislative standing and political question.
And it's worth pointing out, this isn't just Republican presidents, this is Democratic presidents too.
The two military campaigns that exceeded 60 days without express authorization were conducted by Democratic presidents, the Serbian Air War and the Libyan Air Campaign. In both those operations, the president did not get that authorization. Congress supported the operation through legislation such as supplemental funding bills, but they didn't expressly authorize it, and presidents continued to wage the war, and Congress didn't stop them, and the courts wouldn't intervene. So you and I, you know this because we've been writing on this. I think the nation would be stronger. Our situation would be stronger if the War Powers Resolution were actually complied with by its terms. I think we would have been better off had President Trump gone before Congress, laid out his case, and said, you need to authorize this. But I don't think the fact that the War Powers Resolution is not being complied with ipso facto indicates a lack of constitutional authority, so long as Judge Green said, there is evidence of interbranch cooperation. And in that opinion, he actually dropped a footnote and said, perhaps the members of Congress are content that the consultations with the president have satisfied the requirement of their role under Article 1, Section 8. This is what every court that's addressed this issue has said. Our job is to make sure there's cooperation. It's not to tell you how to cooperate. Now, I think that's the moment where we are right now.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, I think I want to get us out of the footnotes and out of the law professors' debates about this and come back to the more international picture, because we also have international practices and international law to think about. And I realize that General Votel may have to step out for just a couple of minutes, but I don't know. Are you able to take another quick question, General, before? Good. Okay. So I want to first start with the fact that Iran, legally or illegally, whatever, however, and we're going to talk about that in a minute under international law. But first, Iran was attacked and responded a little bit like a wounded animal, sort of spewing in all directions, attacking not only U.S. bases, attacking Israel, but attacking countries that weren't part of the initial attack, attacking the Saudis, for example, attacking the Qataris, flying missiles over Kuwait. Now, what is the explanation for that, do you think? How can we understand Iran's response here, and what are its consequences?
Yeah, thanks. I agree. I mean, I guess the word I would use to describe their initial response has been spasmodic, and I think that really is generated from the fact that a heavy part of the campaign was focused on removing the leadership. So there has been the direction, those who would normally provide direction and other things for this have largely been removed. So it's gone further down into the echelons of the remnants of the regime, and so as expected, I think we're seeing the effects of some of that collaboration, coordination, cooperation that would normally be present in a more effective response. That said, what I also think is I think Iran is taking actions that are really focused on broadening the conflict. So hitting softer targets. We've seen them go after hotels. We've seen them go after airports, where civilians are. And I think this is by design. And I think their initial focus may have been that, or may have been, their initial thought may have been that this would cause these countries to put more pressure on the United States and on Israel to stop their activities. I don't know that it has worked that way. I think it has largely backfired in terms of that. But I think they are continuing to do that. And I think the thing we should be concerned about is that Iran does have resources. At the start of this, the estimates were somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 kind of ballistic missiles of various different types that they had in their inventory. And certainly a lot of the launchers and command and control and other things have been destroyed as part of this. But we have to respect the fact that they still have a lot of these capabilities, and they have drones, which can be launched much more easily. So I do think what we are going to see is we are going to see them continue to meter these out. In some cases they'll come in larger numbers. In other cases they'll continue to go after large attacks. I do think they are looking for vulnerabilities that can be exposed, and I think one of the vulnerabilities that could potentially be exposed is the timeline aspect of this. Our president has talked about 4 to 5 weeks, and I think we all appreciate how sensitive that can be in this country. So I think what they're doing is they're trying to broaden the conflict, get as many different elements involved in this as they can, and they're trying to extend their ability to maintain these operations over a much longer period of time.
So what this has done, though, is created this bizarre alliance, right? I mean, what could possibly have gotten the Saudis and the Qataris on the same page, and even more unlikely, get the Qataris and Israel to function as allies in this war against Iran? The Qataris, who have backed Hamas, right?
Yeah,
and sponsored terrorism all around the globe. So how do we think about these shifting alliances, and what does that mean sort of going forward about military operations if those countries enter in a more full-throttled way?
Yeah. Well, if nothing else, the Middle East remains a very interesting place, as you just highlighted here, and people and these different countries are going to act in their own interest. Qatar, in particular, I think, has a very unique foreign policy. They really look at kind of going it alone and having very determined positions on a lot of these kind of top level issues here. So I think what potentially we could see is, I think we could see, and perhaps will relatively quickly see responses from these countries that will be focused on Iran. I think in some cases their people may demand that. Governments will be concerned about doing this, and certainly if this continues and they begin to have economic and effects, and of course causing casualties there, I think these countries will be. So inadvertently, I think Iran's actions could be forming this kind of hybrid coalition here that is, started with the United States and with Israel, and now is going to include other countries who have been drawn into this conflict, who were hoping to stay on the sidelines with this, but now have been drawn into it and must act. So, again, I think we're going to have to pay attention to this. I don't think anybody wants to be engaged in a lengthy conflict here, but I think in some cases, Iran's actions are going to lead to this kind of creation of an ad hoc coalition.
And then one more question before I shift to Ben a little bit on international law, which is, does the 4 to 5 week timeline suggest that the president is seriously contemplating the introduction of ground troops here to you?
I don't think so. I don't read that into it. What I take away from that is that what is anticipated is a rather lengthy air and maritime campaign, using those primary assets that will continue to keep pressure on us. I do think, if we're in for a penny, in for a pound here now, that we've got to keep pressure on this, and we've got to remove the ability for Iran to retaliate. So I do think that is what the focus of this is. There's certainly the decision to put boots on the ground is an extraordinary one that will require a whole series of other capabilities that we'll need to bring in the theater, not just to deploy them into Iran, but to sustain them and keep them going. That's Iran is a huge country, and so ground forces would be consumed up very, very quickly here.
So can the U.S. sustain firepower for that long at the levels that we need to? And what are the chances of, I mean, no one effectuates regime change at 25,000 feet in the air.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And certainly we've had concerns about our magazine depth for some time now, and there's a lot of work we're doing on that. I don't think we are likely to see serious munitions issues in the next few days or weeks. But certainly for a sustained campaign that goes much beyond what has been defined, I think we can begin to see this. I think the bigger issue for the United States is that we are depleting magazines and we are depleting munitions that are needed for deterrence, for readiness in other areas around the world where we maintain vital interests. So, there's nothing is free here, but we're having to move stuff and leverage it for the current conflict. But there is a cost to be paid for that, and that's likely to be seen a little bit further down the line.
Yeah. Okay,
Claire, just a quick comment. I don't think we should ignore the fact that there are other levers of power that we may be utilizing that we don't know about. There's been a shadow war going on between Iran and the United States and Israel for years. So I suspect there are assets functioning to encourage opposition and exploit opportunity. I don't think that boots on the ground is the only gap between air power and effectuating outcomes on the ground that you want. There are other shadow professionals who take immense risk on behalf of the nation and whose names periodically end up on a wall in Langley on a star that we never hear about and we never know about. And I suspect that they're pretty active right now.
Do you want to say something about what those are, especially because our two other panelists are, oh, you're back. Good, Ben. Go ahead, say something about what those are briefly, and then I want to turn to Ben and talk about international law.
No, I mean, listen, I mean, this is the one of the functions of special activities organizations like the Central Intelligence Agency, like Mossad, to take opportunities like this and see if they can encourage dissent within the country. And it would be almost incomprehensible that that has not been thought about, plotted, and maybe they're trying to execute action on it. I'm just saying that I agree with you. You cannot achieve regime change from 20,000 feet. Air and missile power can achieve military objectives, but those broader political or strategic objectives are much harder to achieve. But there are other capabilities that the United States and Israel and other countries have that could be trying to influence that as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about international law and what is arguably the best justification under international law for this operation, because the arguments against it are pretty clear, namely that it was not an imminent threat, that there is no Article 51 self-defense argument under international law, that the action is not authorized by the Security Council as in the alternative, that a proxy war does not create a sufficient imminent threat to justify. So all of those arguments under international law, what are some arguments that you would make to put sort of the best face on it from the standpoint of international law?
Right. Well, I mean, I can't speak as to Israel's official position, but I know that Israel's ambassador to the UN at the Security Council the other day said that this operation is taking place within the context of an ongoing armed conflict between Iran and Israel. And if you have an ongoing armed conflict and an operation that takes place within that context, you don't necessarily have to resort to an assessment as to whether there was an imminent attack and to whether Israel had the right to operate under the doctrine of self-defense and the UN Charter. And I think that ongoing armed conflict is indisputable. It's been going on for many years. It's been overt and covert. It's involved kinetic action and cyber activities. It's taken place on the land and the air and sea, from Iranian territory and from the territory of third parties. There's certainly been direct attacks that have received public expression from 2018, 2019, certainly in 2023 and 2024, massive missile barrages from Iran directly to Israel, and certainly the June 2025 operation between the Israel and US and Iran. But that ongoing armed conflict has also been taking place through Iranian proxies, a number of proxies that Iran has consistently directed, guided, funded, trained, equipped, supplied with intelligence, military know-how, and supported in other ways, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and others. And neither of those, direct and indirect armed conflicts have ended. Both the Israeli and the US intelligence communities have assessed that Iran has continued to build up its ballistic missile program and continue to advance its nuclear program. I think the Iranian president, as recently as December 2025, said that they see themselves in a total war with America and Israel. The IAEA today stated that due to Iran's large stockpile of near weapons grade enriched uranium and refusal to give any inspectors any access, they're cause for, I think, quote, serious concern, and that means that the IAEA can't assess that there only ever nuclear, a civilian peaceful purpose to their program. And certainly, the fact that there hasn't been large-scale hostilities between Iran and Israel directly since 2025 doesn't mean that that state of armed conflict ends. A state of war doesn't end just because there's a temporary lull in killing. And Israel finished that operation in 2025, not with an end state to the armed conflict, but with a bilateral statement that it had achieved its objectives of seriously degrading the ballistic missile program and the nuclear program. And the fact that we've seen Iran, according to these intelligence agencies, increasing those efforts, despite the diplomatic efforts to reach a solution, I think shows that that armed conflict has just been continuing. At the same time, I think officials from both countries have been making statements that perhaps help build the case that you could have seen an imminent armed attack that would have given rise to the right to use self-defense. The fact that they're saying that they've been ramping up those ballistic missile and nuclear programs in a way that within a space of a few months would almost give them immunity, both in terms of their number of ballistic missiles and the stage of the nuclear program, but also in the fact that Iran has been trying to move those components of those programs deeper and deeper underground in a way that perhaps would have made it very, very difficult, if not possible, to reach them through kinetic action. So in that respect, perhaps we were getting to the point where this is a measure of last resort before the last window of opportunity to thwart the existential threat that those programs posed to Israel. And when it became apparent that all reasonable, non-forcible alternatives were exhausted and had indeed been proven ineffective, which would have given rise to this assessment of that there was an imminent attack to which Israel and the US had to take action.
So let's
Can I
yeah,
pick
I
up
want to
on
get
that?
Jeff. I want
Yeah,
to ask you a question just before you
yeah.
intervene on that, because we talked about this earlier today. Um, Take the case of North Korea and South Korea, right? And you can't turn around and have South Korea attack the North and say, well, it's just been a lull in the fighting,
Yeah. It just
right?
said,
After 75 years
yeah.
of no fighting. So how do we know when there is an extended conflict, an ongoing armed conflict between two countries, and it's just a lull in the fighting, and when that fighting is, actually at an end, and there's an end of hostilities? And
Well,
this is a huge question, but
let's
your thoughts?
distinguish Korea. Those hostilities ended with a truce that was negotiated between the belligerent parties, between the United Nations Command and
Okay,
North
fair enough.
Korea. They set up a monitoring system. They set up a
Fair enough.
demilitarized zone. And so the terms of the truce itself indicate a termination of ongoing hostilities. And then, of course, you have the duration of it that has an influence.
So not
I
an end to the
actually,
war, but an end
yeah,
to hostilities. Yeah.
yeah. I actually think that, by the way, listening to Ben, he talks about last reasonable opportunity. It might be an uncomfortable reality, but that was the doctrine of imminence that was embraced by the Obama administration, that when we assess imminence, we look at the gravity of the threat, the probability of it coming to fruition, and whether or not there will be other feasible opportunities in the future to effectively defend ourselves. So, in many ways, I think the United States interpretation of imminence has evolved over the last several decades to be more of a immediate necessity standard as opposed to the traditional Caroline, it's about to happen standard. Having said that, I agree with Ben. I think that when I heard the president's statement initially, and he was talking about 47 years of provocations and the Americans that have been killed by the Iranians and their proxies and the constant periodic acts of violence by the Iranian regime against the United States, I thought that the administration was going to be pressing the theory that Ben just articulated, which is that there is an ongoing armed conflict. I'm on record. I published something in 2023 saying I think it's time we acknowledge that, and not just between Iran and Israel, but also between the United States and Israel. But the imminence or self-defense argument, I think, is the heaviest lift for the administration, and I think that's why they've been flailing. I mean, there's a new explanation for what's imminent, and I think today at some point it even got to the point where President Bush said, "Well, I get to decide when I think something is okay." The real question for me is, if Operation Midnight Hammer was an exercise of collective self-defense, what was the strategic end state? The strategic end state was to eliminate the risk of the threat. So you conduct this campaign for a couple of days, you strike a number of targets, you send a message to the opponent that we are not going to tolerate the continuation of this hostility and this preparation for hostility, and you pause and you see if they get it. And I think that, as Ben says, over the period of time since then, the provocations have not stopped. The reliance of on proxies have not stopped. And they've actually resurrected their effort to try and create a nuclear weapon. So in many ways, I think the president is his own worst enemy with rhetoric, with that whole thing about we obliterated the program and so on and so forth. A more accurate statement would have been, we're confident we set it back. We want to see what the Iranians do. But if we determine that they're trying to reconstitute the program, then we will resurrect our response to it. And I think that's what's happening. And I also think, and General Votel would be better at this than me, but in the limited training I've had on military strategy, the function of a military commander is to identify moments of opportunity to exploit. And Iran has been weakened by Midnight Hammer, by the fact that its proxies have been largely hammered by the Israelis after the October 7th war. And also, they've been more and more isolated by their own brutality towards their own people. So from a strategic standpoint, this was a window of opportunity to maybe unleash the coup de grace, if you will. So I think in that sense, it's logical. And I'll just finish with one point. I find it fascinating to see the dichotomy between the extent of opposition to the legality of the operation in the legal, primarily academic community, and the extent of support for the operation in the military professional community. I think there were 78 retired generals and admirals who signed a letter today indicating their support. And I saw a presentation by H.R. McMaster where the announcer said, how can this be imminent? And he stopped him right away and he said, look, we have to get context right. The issue is not imminence. The issue is 47 years of hostility and shadow war and periodic provocations. And McMaster was not coming at it from an international law perspective. He was coming at it from a military strategic perspective. We've been in a conflict with Iran, and they're not giving it up. And if they're unwilling to give it up, then we will take away their capability to hurt us.
Well, so I mean, let's talk about that. And General Votel, since you're back with us, I want to get some audience questions in. And one of the questions is about the ability to reach enriched uranium under the mountains and buried far under the ground. And as Jeffrey mentioned, I think it was Jeffrey, they keep putting it sort of deeper and deeper underground. So, what is our capacity from the air without the commission of ground troops to get at that enriched uranium? And does that not suggest the necessity for ground troops if we're really seeking the total elimination of Iranian nuclear capacity?
Well, yeah, I'm not fully aware of all of our capabilities. I mean, I'm certain we have extraordinary capabilities that can begin to sniff the earth and understand what's there. We have a variety of ways we can measure outputs and what's coming out of adits and other things there to make an assessment of kind of the damage that has been done underground, and that can help with it. But as you suggest, I mean, the surefire way of understanding this would be to put people on the ground that would actually be able to go into the facility, people who have training, they know what they're looking for, they know what they're assessing in terms of this, and this includes military members, of course, with the ability to kind of reach back to nuclear experts who can help us understand exactly what we're looking at. The challenge of doing that, of course, is we've been talking all about it. I mean, we have to be able to put a force on the ground. We have to be able to sustain them. We have to be able to protect them for a period of time in order to do that. And so far, we haven't yet made the decision to create those conditions that would allow us to do that. So we have relied largely on our kinetic strikes, and then what we can assess through largely visual and measurement means to make the assessment of this. But I do agree. I think ultimately, what you want to know is can only ultimately be achieved by people on the ground.
Now, since you mentioned that, another question that I'd like to ask you is about that interface between on-the-ground intelligence and our in-the-air capabilities. And that hasn't always been a point of perfection for the U.S. Has led us into some difficult situations in the past. Though our intelligence gets better, reporting suggests that the U.S. Supplied intelligence to Israel in this operation has been critical and has been very sophisticated. Not to mention very high levels of and many years in the planning of high-level intelligence on the part of Israelis. There has even been a report I saw that the unit that the Iranians established to identify Mossad agents that had penetrated the Iranian high command was itself run by a Mossad agent and had Mossad agents in its high command. And I don't know if that's true. But does that seem plausible to you? And how effective do you think the intelligence has been from what you can see?
I think the intelligence has been extraordinarily effective. I mean, there is no doubt, and I think we've seen this on display now for several different operations, that Israel's intelligence capacity, setting aside what happened with Gaza here, has been extraordinary in terms of the ability to identify people, to infiltrate networks has been extraordinary. Of course, I have very high regard for our intelligence community and the capacities that they bring to this. I think there has been certainly, improved and extended collaboration and cooperation between both of our services here to make sure that both sides are getting the full benefit of intelligence here. And so, I think this is. I wouldn't dismiss any of that. I think there's extraordinary work that has been done for a long time in this. And I think that is the point, is, Israel has dedicated the time and the effort to this, to build up this network and this intelligence capability over time. And this is, I think, something that we should be thinking about. When you look at, for example, the opposition forces, our ability to, we can't immediately make the opposition forces capable on the ground because we want to do it right now. That has to be done in advance. So in these areas where we have interests, where we have concerns, we have to take the efforts to invest the resources up front and recognize that it will take months and perhaps years to create the networks that will allow us to do some of the precision operations that we're seeing right now.
That's very helpful. And Ben, if I were to ask you about a little bit about these intelligence operations, to the best of your knowledge, are there other countries involved. Apparently, I mean, NATO has come out and said that they are supportive of the operation, which is surprising given the number of NATO countries that have been critical of Israel in the Gaza offensive. Can you talk a little bit about what you expect collaboration to look like going forward, and what your best guess is about how other countries might be involved? Apparently, the UK has been very hesitant, but is now coming around to the position that the US may use UK bases to launch operations so long as the purpose is to defend those bases and to defend UK installations.
Right. Well, I mean, I wish I could speak for other countries, but I think what we do see is that a lot of these countries, as you mentioned, NATO and organizations, they're expressing this shared value, and that shared value certainly between Israel and the United States is that we're talking here about a murderous regime that is, as we've seen today and in the past days, purposefully attacking civilians, and in a way that is designed to maximize death and destruction. I don't know if this has reached your news outlets, but some of the missiles that Iran is firing into Israel, into population centers, contain submunitions, cluster bombs,
Yes,
which
we
are
have
designed to
had
open
those
up and spread
reportings.
throughout civilian areas and cause a widespread damage. And certainly, as Jeff mentioned, the way they treat their own people inside Iran. So there's this shared value that we're talking here about, a murderous regime that really has no legitimacy in terms of both governing its own people and in its role in the wider region. And I think part of this discussion about international law and whether the operation is lawful and whether it's constitutional in the US and so on, it's led some people to start asking questions about the continued relevance of international law and whether we're breaking down the international order. I think certainly both from Israel's perspective and, if I may say, from the US's perspective, I think both of us still see the relevance of international law and the importance of the applicability. And I think that's why, both US officials and Israeli officials are taking the time, whether it's in the Security Council or elsewhere, to put forward our reasoning for this operation and to couch it in the legal language, which gives us the justification for our operations. And certainly in Israel's case, in the last major operation in Iran in June 2025, the Israel published quite a lengthy position paper, factual and legal aspects. If you Google it on Israel's Foreign Ministry website, Operation Rising Lion, key legal and factual aspects, where Israel really went to quite an incredible length and an effort to really put forth its both factual and legal reasoning for that operation. And I think that just gives more expression as to the fact that both Israel and the US still see themselves as beholden by international law and still want to operate by international law. And you see by the facts on the ground that Israel and US are attacking military objectives. They're taking precautions in order to try to mitigate civilian harm. We're protecting our civilian population. And I think that's something that is important to bear in mind when we come to assess both the legality of the operation and also of the individual actions as the hostilities unfold themselves. And I think that we can only hope that that sort of commitment to these values and law, which combines us as an international community, that will help also overcome this murderous regime and bring a new hope for this region, one which is more protective of civilians in general and gives them the opportunity to live full lives and protected lives without this murderous regime overhead.
We are
Hey,
almost out
Claire,
of
Claire,
time. Yeah.
quickly, I just have to say I'm not as confident at the highest levels of our government that there's that shared view of the significance of international law. I have utter confidence that at the operational level, commanders like General Votel and the men and women who are accepting immense risk to comply with the law of armed conflict understand why it's important and see it as completely binding. But I think part of the what appears to be kind of chaos in articulating both a constitutional and legal justification for this campaign is a manifestation of more of a power-oriented approach to
Right.
international law that we will figure out an explanation once we start achieving our objectives. So I don't disagree with Ben at the execution level, at the operational level. I'm not as personally, and other people can disagree with me, but I'm not as confident that there is a um, significant commitment to the integrity of international law at the strategic level.
And we certainly saw that in the OLC opinion on the Venezuela strikes that's been released, though it's still heavily redacted. There was a very brief discussion of international law in which the OLC said, well, of course, the president, it's not really relevant because the president is not bound by international law. So certainly the administration is not a fan of recognizing constraint by international law. And that goes back
That doesn't
many
necessarily
presidents.
mean that doesn't necessarily mean that I believe there's a lack of international legality for this campaign.
Right, I
Those are
understood.
two different issues.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm deeply grateful to all of you for making the time to come on very short notice. I also want to announce that on Thursday, there is another Searle panel. This one is co-sponsored with Penn Carey Law, and it'll be in person, not online, at Penn Carey Law School. And this will be on democracy, democratic institutions, the courts, and feature Professor Sardursky, who is a leading Polish constitutional lawyer and public intellectual who has been visiting at Penn Carey Law. So we've been sending around those announcements, and you'll find it on our website. We'll be following, obviously, developments very closely at the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, all of you, our panelists. Ben, stay safe, for joining us tonight, and to our audience, thanks so much for joining us.